Greetings YouTubers, my name is PhD Tony and today I embark on a new journey, leaving behind the barren, desolate wastelands of flat Earth and turning my attention to another anti-science movement that has gained in notoriety in recent years, that being young Earth creationism. In its most commonly encountered form, young Earth creationism is a religious belief. It comprises the belief that the accounts of the creation and subsequent events given in the Old Testament, particularly in the books of Genesis and Exodus, are literally true and entirely accurate. What I will be presenting in this series is a summary of the scientific evidence that pertains to this question. It therefore seems appropriate to start this series with a discussion of the distinction between religious and scientific thought and the balance that may be struck between them. Scientific inquiry focuses on the acquisition and analysis of evidence and data relating to physical systems and the processes that occur within them. Models that fail to agree with the observational data may be rejected. If multiple models potentially agree with the observational data, then additional observational campaigns and experiments must be developed to distinguish between them. If no current model agrees with the data, then new models must be developed that do. In contrast, religious belief is characterized by a central conviction that remains inviolate regardless of experience, observation, or evidence. There is no adjustment or adaptation of the belief system in response to new discoveries or new developments. By its nature, religious thought is unscientific. That does not, however, make religious thought invalid. Modern society is based on the concept of freedom of religion, which is to say that if an individual chooses to believe in a religious system, despite the fact that it is unscientific, that is their choice. They are at liberty to do so. The reality is that everybody holds unscientific opinions. I prefer the game of Go to the game of chess. There's no scientific validity to my preferences. Similarly, there are questions that science simply cannot answer, and many people take emotional comfort from a religion that does offer answers to these questions. That is entirely valid. All Christians, of course, believe in a creator, that God created the observable universe and in particular that he created humans. In my experience, the vast majority of Christians accept that this process of creation occurred in accordance with the physical and observational evidence available to us, and that the account given in Genesis is a simplified metaphor of a vastly more complicated physical process. Some Christians prefer a more literal interpretation of Genesis and thus conclude that the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. Such a conclusion is, however, directly contradicted by the evidence. That does not make it an invalid religious belief, however. Many religious beliefs do contradict the available evidence. That does not make them invalid religions. It is perfectly possible to believe that the contradictions are inherent in the creation process. In other words, any Christian so inclined can invoke the God just made it that way argument, the existence of evidence that suggests that the creation did not occur 6,000 years ago is somehow part of God's plan for whatever reason. Many young Earth creationists are not content with this argument and go one step further, suggesting that actually the evidence supports the conclusion that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago. In doing so, they have transitioned from being unscientific to being anti-scientific. In asserting this position, they are not only attacking the principles of scientific investigation, but they are also misleading the people around them. They are presenting a falsehood as though it is a fact, and in doing so, they are lying, whether wittingly or unwittingly. To ignore the observational evidence is one thing. To suggest that the observational evidence is wrong is quite another, and completely inaccurate and invalid. There are individual geologists, archaeologists, and biblical scholars who will agree that the evidence does support a literal interpretation of the Old Testament, and in particular the books of Genesis and Exodus. However, this interpretation of the observational record is strenuously disagreed with by the vast majority of academics and scientists working in these disciplines. An objective and intellectually honest assessment of the observational record will admit only one possible conclusion, which is that the events recorded in Genesis and Exodus cannot be regarded as a literally true account of what occurred. To assert otherwise is to esteem one's religious convictions ahead of academic and scientific rigor. I should take a moment here to explain the burden of proof. Let's consider a very simple argument about the age of the universe. If the universe were created 6,000 years ago, then no light from any star more distant than 6,000 light years should have reached Earth. This is immediately and directly contradicted by the observational evidence. It remains possible, however, to argue that the light from these more distant objects was created in transit, or that the speed of light has decreased by many orders of magnitude since the creation of the universe. These suggestions are, however, inherently unscientific. Science is completely uninterested in what might be true. Science is only interested in what the evidence tells us. Explaining away evidence by invoking processes or events for which there is zero evidence is unacceptable. Proceeding down that avenue allows one to accept any event as historical even if there is zero evidence in support of it. Over the course of this series, I will be providing an introduction to the discipline of geochronology, the discipline that allows us to reconstruct the chronology of events in Earth's past. This is a robust and mature scientific discipline with its own extensive literature. The suggestion that its results may be dismissed as unscientific or pseudoscientific is completely unfounded and without merit. A broad and surprisingly diverse range of methodologies are available to geochronologists. Each of these methodologies has its own merits and its own limitations. Each has its own associated uncertainties. Each has its own timescale over which it may be validly applied. It is worth pointing out at this stage that some chronological techniques are only relative. If we find a coin hoard, for instance, the point at which the coin hoard was buried must have occurred sometime after the youngest coin in the hoard was minted. That's really all we can tell. Similarly, if we find moss or lichen on a worked stone surface, then the surface must be older than the moss or lichen, though we should note that that need not be the date when the stone was placed in its current position. On the other hand, some chronological constraints are extraordinarily precise and absolute. We know with great certainty when Mount Vesuvius erupted and covered Pompeii in ash, for example. One of the most common criticisms of geochronology is that the techniques used are not completely accurate. This betrays an essential ignorance of scientific methodologies. Let us consider, for example, the measurement of length or distance. There are a broad variety of methodologies that may be used to measure the distance between 2 points. Micrometers, vernier calipers, rulers, LiDAR, radar, sonar, ultrasound, laser interferometry, for instance. All of these techniques had their preferred length scales over which they are appropriate and their own sources of inaccuracy. It may be appropriate in some circumstances to use a micrometer to measure the width of a particular item. Attempting to use a micrometer to determine the depth of the ocean, for instance, would be completely impractical and next to useless. Most importantly for this discussion, it should be noted that none of these techniques have zero uncertainty. All of these techniques have an inherent limit on the accuracy that they can achieve. The requirement that geochronological techniques have zero uncertainty is therefore spurious. All that is necessary for a measuring technique to be useful is that its uncertainty is small in comparison to the magnitude of the observation. As we shall see through the course of this series, this requirement is more than adequately met by geochronological techniques. In today's episode, I will be focusing on the foundation of chronological studies, which is to say, history, the study of the past. In a technical sense, anything that occurred before the invention of writing is considered prehistory. So we will be restricting our attention to the period after the invention of writing, and we will be comparing the Old Testament record of events against contemporaneous historical records. The most fundamental units used to measure time by all humans in all societies consist of the readily observable rhythms by which the Sun, Moon, and Earth system returns to some preset configuration, or approximately returns to that configuration. For instance, a solar day is approximately 24 hours in length. For an observer on Earth, the time between consecutive full moons is approximately 29.5 solar days. Starting from a given point in its orbit, the time taken for the Earth to return to that point in its orbit around the Sun is approximately 365.24 solar days. All ancient human civilizations recognized these cycles, though they weren't able to calculate their length as precisely as we can today. Nonetheless, all ancient human civilizations were using the same units to measure the passage of time: days, months, years. Having established that different cultures use the same units to measure time, we can now compare their records of what occurred when. Even the most strident biblical literalists will admit that there is some latitude in interpretation of the Bible. The Bible is not explicit about some details. There is therefore not unanimous agreement on when creation occurred. The broad consensus, however, is that creation occurred at some point late in the 5th millennium BCE. The earliest examples of written records that survive to us are from approximately 3500 BCE in the nearby region of Mesopotamia. The biblical creation is therefore a prehistoric event, and we will deal with how to obtain ages for prehistoric events in later episodes. For now, what we will concentrate on is the historical record presented by the Old Testament as compared to the historical records from nearby civilizations. It is very common for literate societies to record the date of birth and the date of death of individuals with some prominence. The wider spread the literacy is, the more pervasive these records are. Also, the identities of particular individuals and their accomplishments will tend to be recorded in commemorative statuary, and also in a variety of public inscriptions. The increasing need for recording various financial or land transactions, legal statements or treaties also led to extensive record-keeping in literate societies, a tradition that still continues to this day. But just because something was written down does not necessarily mean that it is true, and we should be very careful not to uncritically accept something just because it happens to survive in the historical record. The author may have misremembered the facts, or may not have had a clear understanding of what occurred in the first place. They may be deliberately misrepresenting the facts to serve some political, theological, or moral purpose. They may be couching their language using literary or religious allusions that we no longer understand, that dramatically impacts on the interpretation of what is written. Nonetheless, if one approaches the source material with academic rigor, intellectual honesty, and attention to detail, one can construct a reasonably accurate picture of the broad sequence of events. Fortunately for the endeavour we are undertaking, there exist two independent historical records of the period covered by the Old Testament. In particular, we have access to the monumental inscriptions, regnal lists, administrative records, and religious documentation maintained by the authorities of the various Mesopotamian city-states and Egypt. While ancient Egypt has received the majority of the public acclaim for the spectacular archaeological finds located there, the various Mesopotamian cultures have been studied in no less detail and with no less care. As we get closer to the commencement of the Common Era, these are joined by the Hittites, the Minoans, and the Phoenicians. We can take these various historical records and we can compare them against one another. We can also look at the events described in these records and determine whether or not they are plausible given our experience of the physical universe. Conveniently for us, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians used basically the same technique for recording when an event occurred, which was to say this event occurred in the nth year of king such and such or pharaoh so and so. While it was reasonably common for king lists to be engraved on various public monuments, sadly for us these were often damaged, and so the lists available to us are often incomplete. Nonetheless, we can still reconstruct a very accurate timeline for each of these kingdoms, such as the schematic timeline shown here for the Kingdom of Babylon, which had approximately 160 rulers in 1900 years, with an average regnal length of approximately 12 years. Similarly, ancient Egypt had 31 dynasties with approximately 300 pharaohs covering a period of about 3,000 years, which is an average regnal length of about 10 years. In addition to recording political events, trade treaties, wars, battles, encounters with new invaders, both kingdoms also maintained scrupulous astronomical records. They recorded the timing of eclipses, cometary appearances, and other celestial events. In fact, by the 1st millennium BCE, observations were being made of sunspot activity and novas. In fact, these observations and the subsequent analyses are notable for their accuracy, their mathematical rigor, and their attention to detail. So sophisticated was the understanding of the ancients that by the 2nd century BCE, they were producing analog computers that could calculate eclipses, tides, and planetary positions. It is very difficult to entertain the suggestion that people with this level of intellectual sophistication might have severely miscounted the number of years in a particular pharaoh or king's reign. Now we turn our attention to the schematic timeline for the Old Testament. I have broken this section into 3 different periods. The antediluvian or pre-deluge phase, which goes from Adam until Noah was 600 years old, from the post-deluge phase to David, from David to Jesus. The average life expectancy for antediluvian characters in the Bible is about 900 years. From David onwards, the life expectancies seem reasonably normal, one generation corresponding to about 25 years. The period between the deluge and David is one of transition. Initially, the characters are quite long-lived, attaining ages of 600 to 700 years, but over time, their ages decrease. An exactly similar phenomenon is observed in the Mesopotamian and Egyptian king lists, where early mythical kings are assigned absurdly long reigns, of the order of thousands or tens of thousands of years. Even though these claims are written down and purport to be accurate historical documents, we do not accept them as such because their claim is inherently implausible. The suggestion that the Old Testament deserves special consideration as far as analysis of its historicity is concerned is neither intellectually honest nor academically rigorous. At no point in human history has the hypothesis, well, it just happened because God did it, produced any scientifically valuable results. Our understanding of the chronology of past events will not be improved if we invoke this hypothesis now. More specifically, we can consider the historicity of individual episodes narrated by the Old Testament. The Genesis narrative of the deluge, for instance, has no contemporary historical, archaeological, or geological evidence to support it. In fact, there is significant evidence to contradict this particular claim. There is only currently enough ice on the surface of the planet to raise sea level by less than 80 meters, far short of the 10,000 meters required for the narrative to be accurate. There exists no sedimentological layer that may correspond to this event. The material cultures that existed at this time have left uninterrupted material and historical records of this period. The oldest known non-clonal tree yields an age that times it to before the deluge, which would be physically impossible if the deluge were an actual event. Again, we can only accept a narrative as being historical if it is in accord with the independent evidence that is available to us. If it is not, we must reject it as ahistorical. Turning our attention to the narrative of Exodus, we note that it begins with Moses and Aaron petitioning the Pharaoh for the release of the Jewish slaves in Egypt. To bring their point home, they best the Pharaoh's sorcerers in a contest of magic. The Pharaoh remains unconvinced, however, and it is necessary for God to visit a series of 10 plagues on the Egyptians in order to convince him to release the Jewish slaves. These plagues have the desired effect, and Pharaoh agrees to release the Jewish slaves, who then promptly try to depart Egypt. Pharaoh changes his mind and pursues them. God magically separates the waters of the Red Sea so that the Jewish peoples can cross, and hardens the heart of Pharaoh so that he and his army pursue and are destroyed by the inrushing waters. The newly escaped Jewish peoples then wander through the Sinai Peninsula for the next 40 years. There is simply zero historical or scientific evidence for the efficacy or existence of magic. There exists no independent historical account of the 10 plagues. There is no historical or archaeological evidence for the death of a pharaoh or the destruction of an army while crossing the Red Sea. There is similarly zero archaeological evidence to support the claim that a population of 600,000 people wandered the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. Nor is such a claim consistent with the sheer logistical considerations involved. That number of people would have required absolutely enormous resources to support, and the Sinai Peninsula is famous for being arid and inhospitable. The available evidence does not permit us to conclude that the Old Testament can be interpreted as a literally reliable historical source. As illustrated in the table in this figure, it is not until the middle of the first millennium BCE that the biblical account of events begins to agree with independent historical evidence. Viewed in totality, the available geological, archaeological, and historical evidence does not accord with the suggestion that the Old Testament may be interpreted literally. Any suggestion that the evidence available to us is such that an objective observer must conclude that the Bible is literally true is simply false. So I think that will conclude my discussion of the historicity of the Old Testament. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please join me next time when I will talk about rhythmites and dendrochronology.